Now that America is in the war, we need to get our butts in gear and be prepared to fight the war. A lot of that will be possible because of the Office of Price Administration. This is kind of the revised version of the World War I Council. It was created in May of 1940. So again, before we were at war, we kind of knew it was coming. And one of the biggest things that the OPA does is it sets price ceilings. So for instance, on this menu, the menu is printed with the words in accordance with the Office of Price Administration. So this is to prevent price gouging or to prevent a black market. It also was in charge of rationing. Now, price ceilings and rations were for different things. Price ceilings were on, say, commodities, things that were not necessarily in short supply. Rationing was for things that were in short supply or things that the war effort needed. And some people would say, well, why can't people just be logical? Well, in a time of war, people freak out and they hoard. And this again leads to a black market and leads to the country perhaps not being as successful as it needs to be. This is a ration booklet. You had ration tickets for different things. Rubber, sugar, fuel, even nylon that was needed for the war effort, so ladies didn't get to wear their nylon stockings anymore. And another thing that happens is a huge increase in the use of frozen foods. Food is really important to the war effort, and this is connected to the fuel. So these ads are used to convince Americans, did you need to buy that food, maybe an imported food or something that came from far away, or driving your car, as this one says, should brave men die so you can drive? So this is seen as not only a legal thing, but a patriotic thing. It's also the case with victory gardens. Civilians are encouraged to make their own gardens and grow their own food to allow commercial agriculture to grow food for the war effort. So lots of people across the country would grow their own food in order to make up for things that were rationed or in short supply. And I've mentioned earlier that in FDR's 1939 State of the Union address, he talks about the four freedoms. And this, in a sense, does relate to rationing. It talks about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And part of this freedom from want is we will have to temporarily sacrifice during this war in order to, in the long term, protect all of our freedoms. And not everybody liked this. People do not like being told what to do and what not to do and being limited from things that they want. But during a time of war, there are extenuating circumstances, and the government often sees it necessary to ration in order to help the war effort. Women play a huge role in the Second World War. There are different groups that women can join. There are the WACs, the Women's Army Corps, or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, either one works. And these are women who are serving. We're seeing more equal rights in this war. Not only can they work in factories, but they can actually help with the war effort. They will not be in combat positions, but they can do jobs that will free up men for combat positions. The Navy's version are the WAVES, Women Accepted Volunteer Emergency Service. And I love these two ads, that this woman is proud to serve to be independent, and the woman on the right is going to serve in order to end the war sooner and bring her love home. There are also the WASPs. The WASPs are the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Only about 1,000 women were accepted into the WASPs, even though 25,000 applied. All of those who had been accepted already had flight experience and pilot's licenses. Again, not flying in combat. They were shipping planes, ferrying planes from factories to bases, or doing cargo runs. And again, this frees up other male pilots to be in active duty in the war. It's not to say, though, that manufacturing was an unimportant element for women at this war. The U.S. workforce increased significantly in terms of women working in the factories. Um, I love this picture that you might not be a WAC or a WAVE or a WASP and have one of those official uniforms, but you have your own uniform. The women ordnance worker, those who are building the shells, those who are building the planes, that they are playing a vital role in making this war effort possible. And this was really encouraged by Eleanor Roosevelt, who had seen similar things in British society. And of course, the most famous is Rosie the Riveter. Now, there are two famous images. The first one came from Norman Rockwell. This version was on the cover of the Saturday Night Post, and you can see that she's taken a lunch break. She has her riveter there in her lap, and her feet are resting on a copy of Mein Kampf, so demonstrating that it is the effort of the civilians, particularly the women, who will help bring us success over Nazi Germany. But the one you're probably more familiar with is this one. This is actually from an ad for Westinghouse, the company that makes toasters and small electric devices, excuse me. And then there is the song Rosie the Riveter, and that's where the name came from. The problem with mobilizing for war and people who are working on the home front is not everyone is treated equally. Here we have Seuss's cartoon saying, if you want to get real harmony, use the black keys as well as the whites, and pointing at war industry. For African Americans, they still were part of the war effort on the home front. We have women who are working in factories. They're just simply not as celebrated or as well known as their Caucasian counterparts. We do have some activism, though, in the African American community. We have A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington, and he is marching for the purpose of trying to get equal work for African Americans in this economy. He organizes a march on Washington, D.C. The president and Mrs. Roosevelt tried to convince him not to do it, but he went ahead with it. He wanted to make an impression. He is not against the war, and that is going to be the role of James Farmer, who created CORE, the Committee for Racial Equality. And he is more of a pacifist. He had studied Gandhi while getting his divinity degree, and he believes that we shouldn't be fighting any war, and that that especially African Americans should not be fighting in this war. The armed forces were still segregated at this time, but there are African Americans who are already serving. Perhaps one of the most famous is Dory Miller, the sailor who was at Pearl Harbor and on the USS Arizona. And perhaps the most famous group are the Tuskegee Airmen. This is a group of pilots who trained at the Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama, which you'll remember was established by Booker T. Washington. And it took them until 1943 to see combat action because they were not trusted. The Army thought that they couldn't do a good job, but ultimately they flew thousands of missions as bomber escorts and saved lots and lots of lives. And one person, again, that was instrumental in accepting their role was Eleanor Roosevelt. Before the war, she went down there and took a flight with one of the African American flight instructors, and when she got out of the plane, she grinningly said, "Well, you sure can fly." However, African Americans aren't the only ones impacted by this war. Latinos certainly are as well. You see, this propaganda poster is trying to show that Mexican Americans are Americans, so we need to fight for everyone. In an agricultural perspective, there is the Bracero program. This is a joint program between America and Mexico to get braceros, which is workers, to come over and work in the fields, again, freeing up American men to fight in the service. While this was very helpful for these temporary laborers to come help the American agricultural economy, they were treated pretty poorly. You can see there that they are holding very short-handled hose. They were not allowed to use regular-sized garden tools because of their ethnicity, and it was thought that forcing them to use these smaller-sized tools would make them take greater care with the produce. But it was literally back-breaking work. Another example of sort of the lack of respect for the Latino community is with the Zoot Suit riots. In the 1930s and 40s, there was sort of this subculture in Latino communities of swing and sort of the jitterbug. And the zoot suits were these kind of baggy suits. And the guys who wore them were known as the Pachucos. And this is especially applicable to us on the West Coast because the Zoot Suit riots took place in Los Angeles. In 1943, there were a group of sailors who were docked in LA Harbor or San Pedro, and they were sort of trolling around town looking for a good time, and were walking towards a group of Latina women, Mexican American women, and thought that this local group of Pachucos were getting in their way, and it becomes a fight. And the first victims were 12 and 13-year-old boys, and they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so this fighting between the Mexican American community and the sailors starts. And one major problem was that the police did very little. One cop said, quote, "You can say the cops had a hands-off policy during the riots. We represented public opinion, and many of us were in the First World War, so we weren't going to pick on kids in the service." So again, we're seeing that while we think of the Second World War as being this great time of patriotism, there are still problems within it. We also have the Navajo code talkers. The Navajo language was an entirely verbal language. It wasn't written. It's a very small group of people. They only were about 50,000 in total number of citizens. And about 400 or 500 of these Navajo men joined the Marines to help create a code that would be virtually uncrackable by the Japanese. And this was really important because you would have two of these people who would be speaking in Navajo, and they would translate military terms into the Navajo language, and the Japanese just couldn't figure it out. And they were going to be essential in a lot of the Pacific battles that we'll talk about later. The last major group I want you to know about is the 442nd Combat Team. This is a unit made up of entirely Japanese Americans, Nisei. And these were men that after they had been interned, after a year in the internment camps, they decide they want to volunteer for the war effort. FDR wasn't going to allow it at first. He thought maybe this was some sort of trick, but these were men who wanted to serve their country. They trained in Mississippi, where for them they were very shocked to see the Deep South and how African Americans were treated. And then they were sent to Italy in 1944. And I love this picture that we've got Japanese Americans holding up a Nazi flag after the defeat of the Axis. But if you looked at this, you might not know they were Japanese Americans. And it's really, really important that these men were able to serve because they were trying to sort of demonstrate their Americanness, that even though they were treated horribly, that they weren't going to let that dampen their pride in being a citizen of the country.